Hi there. Although this tutorial will continue from the point at which I left off in last week's tutorial, you can view this as a standalone tutorial. This tutorial will talk a little bit more about the different types of lights and how they might be used, whereas I covered quite a bit about rendering in cycles as well as the basic light in the last tutorial. So there'll be a link in the description below to the previous tutorial if you want to go and have a look at that one. So the light I've got in this scene is a point light. You can see it's in here. Now we're in cycles for these tutorials. There are some differences between cycles and EV, and in fact, although you have the same selection of lights, EV doesn't actually currently support as many different types of lights as cycles does. That may change in the future. This is for Blender 3 at the moment. I already spoke last week about the fact that you can vary the power of the light here, and a few people commented that you could also affect the brightness of the scene by changing some of the render settings such as exposure and things like that. So you have that here under render properties, and you can see there's an exposure setting here, and it brightens or dims the scene. But I generally just leave that at 1. So we've got the basic brightness of the lamp, and in Eevee there's also a setting to configure fall off, or how quickly the light gets dimmer with distance. It doesn't have that by default in Cycles because Cycles is a physically based render engine, and it's designed to simulate how real light would work. So as you double the distance, you get half the light incident on any particular object. But nevertheless, if we open up another window and change that to the shader editor, you'll notice there's a use nodes option for the lamp as well. So if I click that, you can see we get a couple of nodes. So we've got an emission going into our light output. So if I look for light fall off node, we can bring this one up and we can put that into the strength. So I could say quadratic, for example, put that into there. The strength is 100 at the moment, which is obviously increased the strength of that light. It was only 50 watts, so we'll put it back to there. So we're going to bring the strength right down, but you can see that's affected how the light falls off. We're having to make the light much dimmer now to be able to not over saturate the scene. If I take that out and I bring that strength down quite a bit, you can see that's basically the same. But if I put in linear, it's a subtle effect, but effectively that's just falling off in a very simple fashion. It's not an inverse square fashion the way real light would fall off. And then we've got constant here. So you can try some different approaches to get the effect that you want, to change whether make a light more or less subtle in the way that it appears to get less bright with distance. And there's a smoothing option here as well. So we want to turn the brightness up there. So you can see you can hardly see any fall off there with relatively high smoothing. It's almost as if this one light is illuminating the scene completely from its one position. It's still casting shadows. So you can play around with that. And of course, because there are nodes, you can do other things such as put textures in and so on to give you interesting effects. I'm just going to take that fall off node away, and we'll just close that window and we'll have a look at the other kinds of lamps. So the next most common one you're likely to use is the sun lamp. It typically comes across as brighter, so we'll just turn that down a little bit. And if we look from the side, I'll come out of rendered view. We can see it's a little sun symbol with a straight line. The straight line is indicating the direction of the rays. Because the sun has a relatively small angular size, appears to be relatively small in the sky, even though obviously it's huge. By the time the rays reach us on the Earth, we treat them as parallel because the angle between the rays is so small by the time it reaches us that for all intents and purposes, over the small dimensions that we see things, they look parallel. So this is just indicating the direction that those rays will take. We go to the rendered view now and zoom in a bit. I've got filtering on, and you can see we just got some nice shadows there, and that's with an angle of 0.526. Now this angle on the sun lamp is what we use to simulate there being a certain amount of cloud or mist in the air that is diffusing the light and effectively making the source of the light bigger than just the image of the sun itself. So if I set that to 0, it doesn't change the brightness, but the shadows become very crisp. You can see they're completely well defined there. We can take that up to a much bigger number. And I did find if you just type in 180, it actually has an error and doesn't give you anything. But as soon as you back it off a little bit, it does, and it's still 180 degrees. So essentially, that's a completely diffuse sun. So unlikely to use that very often, but you might use a smaller number. So here, we've still got these parallel sunbeams, but they are very, very diffuse because it's a 50 degrees angle. And you can see there's our shadow, but it's diffuse. So in other words, the light doesn't just come straight into this ball and be reflected so that it can't shine on the surface. some of it almost goes around the ball because the light source is so large. You can see it here. If I make this down to 1 degree, it is actually so small there, you can just see a little dot. So that's really giving you a good idea of what's going on. So you can vary that to give you an impression of whether it's an overcast day or a very bright sunny day. Same setting here with max bounces, of course, and the colour. And typically for sunlight, I don't use the default white colour, even if that's probably more 100% accurate. I normally make it slightly warmer with just a little bit of yellow in it, especially if you've got contrasting light sources, such as you might have a lamp in the scene that's giving off a lot of light, for example. And of course, you can also simulate the light that might be coming from the moon using this lamp. And the way I usually do that is just change it to a slightly blue colour and obviously not have it too bright. And that sort of gives you an impression of a nighttime scene. Just make sure you select the right kind of blue and don't do too much blue because it will look a little odd, unless of course that's the artistic effect that you're going for. But you will also start to lose colours. You can see red doesn't reflect blue light very well, and the more blue it becomes, the less other colours we've got in the scene. So you want it essentially white with just a hint of blue or a hint of yellow, depending on whether it's the sun or the moon you're trying to simulate. The position of a sun lamp in the scene doesn't matter because it is parallel rays. Although it shows it here, the only reason for having this line and this central point is so you can get an idea easily of where the shadows are coming from. And you can see them moving around here, but it doesn't change the fact that this is parallel rays being projected in this direction, not diverging rays as they would be from a point lamp. And you can see it's read across the fact that we're using nodes here because it's showing the node setup. It's just put in its default node setup. So let's change that to a spot lamp now. So this is literally a simulation of a lamp with a shroud around it and a reflector, and it's designed to point at a particular place and not shine just everywhere. So I'll turn the power up. You will find each of the lamps has its own effective brightness. I'll put that up to 100 watts, I think, maybe even more than that. When I'm playing around with light brightnesses and things like that, I'll tend to double and double or halve and halve until I start to get somewhere near what I need. So a couple of things about this. You can see there is our spot. You can see here, if I look from the front, that's the direction it's pointing from this axis, from the front. And if I look from the side, that's the direction it's pointing there. If I look from a corner, you can see what that means. And it draws this cone. I can show the cone better than just an outline like that if I click here, and then it literally sort of draws a cone that I can see what it's intersecting. Very useful here because it gives me a very clear indication of where the edge of the cone is, which is not always clear because I may want to have a fuzzy edge to the cone, and that's what this blend element does. If I turn that down to 0, it's not a completely hard line, and if I put that up to maximum of 1, you can see it's much fuzzier. So that's what the blend does for us. And then what we can do, and I'll just leave it with a little bit of blend, is affect the angle of the lamp. So this is how wide this spot spreads. So if I turn this right down, I can go all the way to 1, and you can see, you may see it's just illuminating a little bit there. Maybe I'll put 1000 watts on it so we can see a bit more. And as I turn it up, it illuminates more and more of the scene. And of course, we're starting to get light bouncing off other things, bouncing off this surface, then off other things, and then finally finding its way to the camera. And we can widen it up like that. And we can go up all the way to 180 degrees. So it's almost an area lamp at that point. Again, we can play with things like the radius of the lamp, which will also affect how sharp shadows are and so on. So if I turn that right down to 0, that's actually now given a somewhat harder line for the transition. And if I turn the blend down as well, now we've got a completely hard line because I've turned the radius down to 0. So if I turn the radius up, well, I'll go to somewhere in between at the moment. Now we've got a soft line for transition and the shadows are soft. And obviously I can go up to quite a large size with that. Once you get beyond a certain point, it doesn't really make sense anymore. So even at 0.2, it's giving us relatively soft shadows. And then I can play with the blend to just simulate even softer fall off for the light on the edge. You will see on some of the lamps this multiple importance. This is used during rendering, and it allows Blender to make a judgment on whether it should render more samples in particular areas, typically used with HDRI images. And we can turn shadows on and off. So if I click this little button here, no shadows. So it's almost like these things are floating. Sometimes you might want to do that if you want to add a little bit of extra fill light to a scene, but you don't want it creating lots of shadows. You can put that in there. but obviously it does look somewhat artificial. So then moving on to the final lamp, which is the area lamp. So you can see it's as if it's a flat surface, and that flat surface is emitting light. I'm going to turn the brightness down a bit now. So if I bring it close to the surface, you can see there's no light coming out behind the lamp, or very little anyway. It's as if I've got a glowing surface just emitting light. But it's very useful because you can play around with the size. If I have a much larger lamp, that can be very useful to simulate light coming in from a window, for example, without actually having a lot of light sources outside. I'll talk about this little click box in a moment. Most of the rest works very similarly to the spotlight, except size genuinely affects the size of the lamp that we've got. And I'll often use an area lamp for fill light. So you can see the shadows are very soft here. It is like there is a window just there with some light coming in at all angles through this portal and giving us a nice even illumination if that's what you want for that particular scene. And obviously you can vary the size either here or directly with just scaling it to affect the sharpness of the shadows. And we've got a spread option here, so the default is 180. If I start to turn that down, now you can see it's only 20 degrees spread now, so it's barely illuminating the surface that I slightly embedded it in. But one of the good things about that is actually, because I don't have any other lights in the scene, we're being able to see some of the irradiance of reflected coloured light from these objects on the surface down here, particularly visible here. And if we look at the reflection in the sphere over here, as I rotate round, you'll see it'll suddenly appear when it comes within that 20-degree point. So if I take it just slightly outside and then start to turn this up, suddenly the lamp appears. Fairly straightforward lamp, one I use quite a bit when I want to do area lighting, because I can control it so easily. Regarding the portal, you use this both in Cycles and in EV, and this basically changes what this is for. You can see it's not emitting any light once that's selected. So the portal setting, you'll see, disables the lamp and it turns it into something called a portal. The idea is, particularly when you're using HDRIs, you might have a window in an interior scene and you want light to be scattered into the scene, and you want it to be done efficiently. A portal helps to guide Blender that there is a hole that is designed to let light through into the scene, and it will effectively give you somewhat faster renders and certainly better quality of light bouncing around the scene, because Blender knows the light that hits the area of the scene that isn't a portal isn't going to make it inside the area in question. It's a bit of a subtle thing, but if you are making an internal scene that's illuminated by light that effectively from an outside world, generally it's a good idea to put a portal in, so which is just putting one of these area lights with the portal setting turned on. You can see there under the description, it guides the sampling of the background in order to help get a better quality of illumination through that portal or window, if you like. So that's the basic lights provided as defaults, but there's another kind of light that you can add into the scene. If I delete that one and our scene goes black, and I'm just going to add a plane. We'll make it a little smaller and we'll lift it up. And what I can do is go to materials and say new, and you can either do this in the node editor or here, because it's relatively simple. We can change the emission. So I'm going to set the emission to a color of white, and it's already got a default strength. So if we look at the rendered view now, we're getting light from it. So if I turn the strength up, as you would expect, it gives out more light. I'm going to make it a little smaller. And this is the thing to what with object-based lamps, which only work in Cycles currently, by the way. So with object-based lamps, the smaller the object, the dimmer the light will be, the less light it will appear to emit. So you can see I'm bringing it quite close to the surface there and just changing the angle a bit. And again, obviously, if I didn't want it to show up in a reflected surface, just as you would now with a normal lamp, I would just go to the object properties and, for example, turn it off in glossy. And now you can't see a reflection of it as such, but you can see all of the other forms of the light that you've left switched on. So we can play around with the emission strength, it's bouncing around there, as well as, of course, the color. And you can also make some unusual shapes, of course, which will give you some interesting distributions of the light. So it'll be very bright from some areas and not in others. You also might want to, under the object properties, remove the camera option. So you can see it's still visible there. If I turn off both the camera and glossy, the light itself is not visible, especially if I turn this off. The lamp itself is not visible, but the light it is emitting is very much visible. as you can see. So I hope you found that initial primer on the use of various different kinds of lamps in Blender useful. If you've got any tips and suggestions, or if you've got anything else that you'd like to know about, either to do with lights or cycles or Eevee or anything else that you'd like me to produce a video about, just leave me a message in the comments below. I do read them all, and if I think I can make a useful video about it, I will. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. It really helps me out, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.